It's the bird emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I am your pretend scientist because I hold a what do we call it? An applied science diploma in horticulture. So there we go. My scientific background is nothing to celebrate. Let me tell you that. But as always, I am speaking to someone who has a CV and a backlog of work that anybody should be proud of. Now, I have been informed that for professional purposes, we are talking to Daniella Teixiera. But hopefully at the end of the podcast, Daniella said her friends refer to me as Danny. So hopefully at the end of the show, I'll be talking to Danny. But let's see how we go. Daniella, hello, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No worries.
You could call me Danny, it's fine.
Oh, ripper. Now, Danny's on board because a lot of you in the Australian bird nerd world will probably have come across some of her work. Before the lockdown, we were all hearing about the fires that hit us before the pandemic swept in and diverted our attention. And Kangaroo Island suffered greatly from the media reports. Danny's going to tell me if I'm right or if I'm wrong, but something like 50% of the island was burnt. And that means that a humongous proportion of the habitat of the Kangaroo Island Glossy Black Cockatoo was burnt. So Danny's going to tell us about the situation there. So let's start there, Danielle.
Yeah, sure.
What's the future for the Glossy Black Cockatoo on Kangaroo Island, in your humble opinion?
Yeah, so starting with the big questions. I was really surprised, and it gave me a lot of hope that the post-fire population count of the Glossy Black Cockatoo on Kangaroo Island was higher than the count that we did in 2016, which was the previous count. So there were no population counts of the Glossy Black Cockatoos on Kangaroo Island in 2017, 2018, or 2019, when they normally do them in spring. And so that was over the course of my PhD. I was really only involved in the very first count in spring in 2016, and there was about 373 birds counted then. And when I say a count, I actually do mean like a population census. That's what they call it, the recovery program, because the island it's quite a big island, but the habitat where the Glossy Black Cockatoos occur is actually quite small, and it's really well known. There's a really great team of people working on the island. So they go out to all the little patches of habitat, the flock regions, they count them all. And they were doing those annually, but during the course of my PhD, there was some funding cuts on the island and they weren't actually able to do that. So really what I thought when the Black Summer fires hit was that there was going to be a massive decline in the population size because so much of their habitat was impacted. I was really pleasantly surprised that after the fires, there was still over 450 birds counted on the island, and they had managed to move out of the burn area further to the eastern end of the island where the habitat wasn't impacted. So in terms of direct impacts, like direct mortality, it didn't seem to have a great impact. Granted, we didn't know exactly what the population was right before the fires hit, but it does show that they were able to move away. The real question we have now is, what is the carrying capacity of the island today after the fires? What is the extent and the quality of the feeding habitat that remains, and how can that support the population going forward? So there's a lot of questions in that. We've got some work, an honours student and subsequent work done by the guys on Kangaroo Island that did quantify the extent of feeding habitat that was lost. And then we actually measured or predicted what the quality of that feeding habitat was, because Glossy Black Cockatoos only feed on she oak. And on Kangaroo Island, it's actually only one species of she oak that they feed on. So that's the drooping she oak. And it has quite a short lifespan. compared to other trees. So it's one of these really tricky situations where she oak needs a little bit of fire, but not too much fire. And what we found is that most of the habitat that's remaining on the island is very long unburnt, and it's actually senescing. And what our honour student found was that those areas on the island have poorer feeding quality. So what does that mean for the population? We're not sure. We're not sure how that's going to impact breeding. For now, they're probably feeding on suboptimal quality habitat. That's what I would guess. But because they are so long-lived, they're really intelligent birds. Perhaps they'll just kind of skip a few breeding seasons, but they'll be able to hang on. But where does that actually leave them in 10 years' time? There might actually be sort of a delayed decline in the population.
Has there been a long enough time in between when the fires occurred and the monitoring that the team on the ground are doing now to see if there is an acceptable, if I can use that lovely non-scientific term, an acceptable recruitment of seedlings for the she oaks, or is that looking like being a problem in the near future?
So I'm guessing you're referring to the burn area. So So recovery. So she oaks, the species of she oak on the island does regenerate fairly quickly. So you can start to see the seedlings coming through quite quickly. But the problem is, and this is what's happened on the island before, it's sort of really tricky situation because in some places the she oaks will be burnt or they'll die, and they might actually be lost in that area altogether because other plants will take over. And we've actually seen that. So Flinders Chase was the really big national park on the island, the wilderness area, and that's where the fire started. So when you see the maps of Kangaroo Island, that's the far western side of the island, and the fire started there and then spread east. That part, the far western end of Flinders Chase, actually used to be glossy black cockatoo habitat back in the 80s and 90s. But a couple of successive severe fires were enough to actually wipe that habitat completely and change the landscape. And glossy black cockatoos never returned to those areas. So we might actually be seeing something like that happening again now. And that's the real concern, is which places are actually able to recover. So yes, she oaks need a bit of fire, but in some places that have had fire before, or in some places where perhaps the fire was far too hot, it might not actually come back, at least not in the capacity that it was. That said, other places might have benefited because the fire wasn't extreme in every single location. So some places that were long unburnt might actually now come back better, but that's going to take time.
Okay. Now, your PhD was in threatened species monitoring. Now, my horticulture background has my brain ticking over and going, well, she oaks you get a pretty good return from a kilogram of seed. And I'm thinking, so producing the seedlings to revegetate areas in would probably be a fairly cheap in comparative terms. But is that a suitable strategy that can be used there on Kangaroo Island?
It is, and they are doing that. So the nursery on the island is actually growing seedlings, and they have already started planting them. And the really great thing about Kangaroo Island is that the recovery program there has been growing and replanting she oaks for a long time. And some of the places where you are almost guaranteed to see glossies year round, they're actually revegetated areas. So old cattle properties that were really degraded, within 10 years of seedlings being planted, the glossies are there feeding on them, and they're high quality seed. So there's huge scope really for habitat regeneration if you can find the land to do that, and to be strategic about it, because the main threat to glossies, apart from habitat loss, is still breeding success. So you need to be a bit clever about where you try and revegetate to maximize their access to food to support breeding. So absolutely.
Well, let's extend that thread a little bit further, and perhaps in the with bearing in mind the eternal conflict with any kind of habitat loss and revegetation is which side of the ledger is winning. On Kangaroo Island, is the revegetation effort and the rehabilitation, the natural rehabilitation of the areas that have been burnt, is that keeping pace, or is it ahead of new land clearing that is happening on the island?
So I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but in my experience, there's not a whole lot of land clearing that's really happening on the island anymore. Most of the island, or a lot of the island, has already been modified for agriculture. Significant tracts of forest have been turned to plantations and also for grazing, particularly sheep. So I don't think that modern day land clearing on the island is such a problem. I think the real risk now is fires, in addition to nesting success and those sorts of things. But it's pretty remarkable the areas that have been revegetated and how quickly they've come back. I think there's potential there to kind of expand upon that and really connect up some of the patches of habitat. It's very, very patchy, the she-oak habitat on Kangaroo Island.
Now, the glossy black cockatoos are a big bird, fairly big. Just for those perhaps Northern Hemisphere listeners who aren't familiar with our cockatoos here, if you've ever seen a white cockatoo with the sulphur crest in a cage, glossy cockatoos are about the same size, perhaps a little bit larger. So that gives you an idea. If you think about a large rook, something like that, hello everyone in England, we might be talking about a similar sized bird.
Yeah, they are the smallest black cockatoo species, though. So I think of them as small compared to the other ones.
Yeah. Yes, your red-tailed black, which we'll get to shortly, and the yellow-tailed black, a bit bigger. But the pressure on nesting sites and the success of each year's breeding, what are the main pressures and issues there, Danny?
So if we're just talking about Kangaroo Island, specifically, because there's very different situations on the mainland.
We'll start just with Kangaroo Island and any measures that are particular to there.
Yeah. So on Kangaroo Island, the main threat is actually predation by brush-tailed possums. That's the number one threat to nesting success. It's actually quite a remarkable situation. So if I just kind of diverge for 1 second, I always say Kangaroo Island glossy black cockatoo is a really wonderful and rare conservation success story in Australia, which I think we need to hold on to these things because there's not that many success stories that we can that can give us hope. But the recovery team back in the 80s and 90s realized that possum predation was a real problem. And so what they've done is on every single nest tree, they put an iron collar around the trunk of the tree, and that stops the possums from climbing up the tree. So they can't actually get into the nest hollow. And in the last 10 years or so, they've taken that one step further, and they actually prune the canopies of the neighboring trees so possums can't jump across. So the whole range of things that they do to stop possums getting in. Essentially, if a tree isn't protected, it's almost guaranteed to fail due to possum predation on Kangaroo Island. So every single nest tree, natural nest tree, and trees where they put artificial hollows, they put these iron collars on the tree trunks. And the team goes out every year and checks a whole bunch of them and fixes them up if there's gaps. And it's quite a remarkable intensive effort, but hugely successful.
And that information has to inform anyone who's going out and doing replanting, because your densities have to be quite low so that you don't get that canopy crossover. It's quite, exactly. It's tricky. Yeah, that's I wasn't aware of that. And the brushtail, is that unique to Kangaroo Island that they are predating on the cockatoos, or is that something that we, the general public who isn't in the in bird academia, just isn't aware of? Are brushtails predating on all hollow nesting birds?
Well, they certainly are on Kangaroo Island. So I'm not sure on the mainland what the risk really is, or the level of threat that they provide. But the few nests that we've monitored here on the mainland are not protected. And sorry, when I say mainland, I mean here in southeast Queensland, where I'm based. They're not protected with iron collars, and I've never had any evidence of possums even using the tree. And I know this because I put sound recorders on trees, so I've not had the detections of the possums' vocalizations. So I think it's a big problem on Kangaroo Island. There is some suggestion that that's because the island is so modified for agriculture, and that increases the abundance of these possums. And a lot of the glossy nest sites are actually either on farmland or right adjacent to farmland. So they're not really in sort of pristine forests that you might think. And the same is true for the red-tailed black cockatoos that I work on as well. Most of the nests are in paddocks, and there has been one study that's looked at nest competition, and we think possums may have been involved in some nest failures, but very limited understanding of that threat anywhere other than Kangaroo Island, as far as I'm aware.
And to give us an idea of the prevalence of hollows on Kangaroo Island again, just for that location, how much of the hollows that are available for nesting are artificial hollows that have been provided by the recovery team?
It's a lot. It's something like 50% of the nests now that the glossies use are artificial hollows. That's not to say that that's those are the ones that are monitored. So there's several hundred nests that the recovery team knows of and that they try and monitor each year or every other year. And about 50% of those are artificial hollows. And they keep putting them up because the birds use them, and they're hugely successful on that island. So.
And how many, I don't want an exact figure, but sort of give us an idea of a percentage perhaps of how many of those hollows are being monitored and what form of monitoring is being undertaken.
Yeah, it's quite an intensive monitoring program. So I feel like I keep repeating myself with Kangaroo Island, but they've had such a wonderful recovery program for a long time that's been fairly well funded comparatively to other species and even to glossies here on the mainland. So the recovery team essentially will go out and check as many of the known nest hollows as possible each year. So the start of the breeding season, they might even start as early as January or February. They'll go out, a couple of the field officers will go out, check on all the known nests, or at least the ones that they suspect might be used in the really high value nesting areas. And then they'll repeatedly go back out there a couple of times during the breeding season just to check. And particularly if they did find, that a nest was active. So most of that is actually done sort of just through traditional methods. They'll go out, they'll just look in the nest hollows. So they might climb the tree. Sometimes they do that, but more often than not nowadays, they actually have a really long pole with a camera on the end, just a tiny little camera that they stick in, which is pretty cool. And that pole goes up something like 18 meters, I think. So it's quite high. And the other method that they do is just kind of give a little tap on the tree, and a female, she won't flush. She normally doesn't flush. She might just pop her head out and have a look at you. And then my work, yeah, exactly. It's quite funny that she'll just sort of stare at you for a while and go, "What are you doing?" And if you just back away slowly, all is well. And then my work is focusing on bioacoustics. So that was the other method that was being used for the previous 5 years when I was doing my research there. So it's quite an intensive program. It's the most intensive nest monitoring program probably in Australia for black cockatoos. So,
well, that seems like a really good place to talk about your bioacoustic monitoring work. Give us an idea of what you do, what equipment is required, a bit about the methodology of the of setting up the study.
Yeah. Well, bioacoustics is it's an old sort of scientific discipline, I suppose, but it hasn't really been accessible to field ecologists until recently because, back in the day, you had to lug out a whole lot, a whole heap of heavy gear, and you had your tapes, and you had to kind of sit there with it and whatnot. And you weren't able to really collect data over a long period of time. But now technology has improved so much. We have a whole range of sound recorders on the market now. So we have really high quality, fairly pricey units that can do all sorts of schedules and GPS tracked and all sorts of things, solar panels, like the whole lot, all the way down to really cheap, tiny little recorders that are smaller than your phone, and you can just stick them out there.
So something like the Zoom H4n, things like that, with a directional mic and a dish, is that the kind of thing you were using, or what?
Not quite. So for my PhD, I specifically used one type of sound recorder, and it's by a really great company called Frontier Labs. So they're a local company.
Yep.
And they create really excellent products, and they weren't too expensive. And they're not directional microphones, so they're omnidirectional, so they can capture a whole range of sounds. But in the projects that I'm currently working on, we're using these tiny recorders called audio moths. And they're really cheap. They're only about $50 or something. And we do that because we can then monitor, say, 100 sites at once. So you can't really do that if your sound recorders cost $1,000 each. But if they're $50, it's affordable. Yeah, so the technology has come a really long way. And I suppose the point of my work when I started out, I'm quite a, I suppose, outcome-focused person. I don't like to just do science for science sake. I really want to help achieve outcomes. So what I did when I started my PhD was go straight to the people who would potentially use a new monitoring method and said, what do you need to know? What is missing in your monitoring program? Or what do you think you could, if you could save money with sound recorders, what would you like to that to be able to do? And the response, particularly from the red tail recovery program, was we really need to be able to monitor nesting success. So it was really about success. So even if we find active nests, currently we don't have any way to follow that through to fledging to actually figure out if they're breeding successfully. So when we started, we didn't know if nesting success was 0 or was it 70% or somewhere in the middle. We knew on Kangaroo Island it was probably about 50%. So with that in mind, I kind of decided I really needed to figure out if there was anything particular in the black cockatoos vocalizations that could tell me what was going on at a nest, and particularly if it was successful. So to do that, I spent a lot of time in the field creating a full call catalog, essentially like a library of their vocal repertoire, to understand what all the different sounds mean, so that when we leave a sound recorder on a tree for the full nesting period, which is about 4 months, when I collect that data, I can actually analyze that and tell you everything that was going on. And it turns out that there is actually a particular sound that happens at fledging, a very specific, unique sound, or it's quite a chaotic, loud sound. And I've now actually built some call recognition software to detect just that event. So now we can actually monitor without being there. We might only have to go out there, once to deploy the sound recorder and once to collect it. But we can see exactly which nests survived, which ones fledged. And if they didn't survive, we can actually work our way back and figure out when they might have died, and potentially if that was, say, due to predation by a possum, because you might capture those vocalizations, or it might be really early, say during incubation or brooding, before the nestling is even vocal. We can actually tell that just from the sound recordings. So yeah, it's a really neat way to track things through time quite cheaply.
Okay. Are you happy to completely nerd out at the moment?
Sure.
Okay.
Of course,
so
anytime.
Okay. Well, I'm interested in two things. One about the method. Where do you place the audio moth, which sounds like a fantastic piece of kit? How do you make that decision? And then practically, where do you place it? Is it a nest box or is it on the tree or something? And then what I want you to tell me is, how are you doing the interface between the audio examination software, for want of a better term, picking up those particular calls at fledging, and then how are you getting the interface into some kind of software where you can, like for instance Excel or something similar, where you can actually look at the results? What's that, the process, the function, the nuts and bolts of actually getting the noise into your spreadsheet?
Into data, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first question about where do you place it, that's an excellent question. And I get that question quite a lot. And it was something I had to address even in my PhD thesis, because a lot of studies, or a lot of scientific studies in this area, try and capture all the vocalizations that a species might give, and that's great. So in those cases, they might be putting microphones like actually inside a nest because a lot of vocalizations are really soft and you can't hear them unless you're right up close. But I did think about that, because we could climb the trees, we could put little microphones inside the nest hollows. But what I really wanted was, again, thinking about the outcome, was something that the government person who's on the recovery program can actually do, and what data would be available to them. So it's not about monitoring everything that happens at the nest, although that would be awesome and I would be, fascinated by it. It's not really achieving what that program needs it to achieve. So I didn't even sort of entertain that idea. I just went straight for, right, this is what we would do. What data can we get from that? And so my thinking was really limited by particularly the red-tailed black cockatoos, because they actually nest almost exclusively in dead trees, like paddock trees. So glossy black cockatoos will nest in live trees. So this is on Kangaroo Island, mostly in live trees, or nest boxes in live trees, but the red tails in dead trees. So it's not really feasible for the recovery team to be climbing up, and it's unsafe basically. And also for time, you don't want to have to waste, you don't want to spend a whole day having to install 2 sound recorders. So what we basically did was just put sound recorders almost at like my height, like just straight on the trunk of the tree, and with the omnidirectional microphones, the really high quality ones, they were able to capture all the sounds at a nest. So the really great thing about cockatoos, they're sort of the epitome of loud and raucous,
noisy neighbors.
Exactly. They really characterize that. So I wasn't worried about missing their sound. So, if there was a species that was quieter, perhaps it calls at a much higher frequency, I would perhaps be worried about the distance of the microphone to the nest, but that wasn't a consideration really for the cockatoos, because they're so loud at nests. And I already knew this from spending time in the field at nests. So basically I just went out, stuck them at my own height, but I did have some run-ins with possums. So my first season, I went back to collect my sound recorders, and a whole bunch of my microphones had been chewed by possums. So that made for some interesting sounds. So after that, I actually made sure that I always put the recorder above the collar, which sometimes required me to have a ladder, but I didn't try and get it any higher than that because it wasn't necessary.
Okay, and you didn't try and get complete coverage, audio coverage of like a survey area. It was targeted at trees, particular individual trees.
It was. And again, that's a really good question. I get that question a lot. How do I know that I'm listening to that nest and not like another one? And it's actually really easy to see in a sound when you look at, I suppose it's getting a bit into the software, but when you actually look at a sound file, a spectrogram, which is a visual representation of sound, it's really easy to see which ones are closer than the other ones.
Like
And
the size of the peak or the density, depending on what software you're using.
Yeah, the loudness is an obvious one, but also your high frequency kind of components of the call will drop out with distance. So it's really quite easy. So there's, potentially you would have some issues if two nests were really close together, which sometimes happens. You might be picking up both. But most of the time, that you're really listening to the nest that you've got on the tree of that one. But I have this sort of pie in the sky idea that one day we can kind of just have, a couple of sound recorders in a habitat patch, and you could perhaps triangulate to the nests and figure out which ones were active and which ones weren't and stuff. And I totally think that's possible. It's just not something we've really explored yet. But for now, it's one recorder per tree. So
that to me, with the limited audio processing and analysis that I do, I think certainly a lot of the visual representations of waveforms now probably should allow you to do that. So so that will be when you're running the department somewhere at the bioacoustics department of some university. You'll be running that. So the next part of that theme was how are you getting, how are you sorting and analysing the data and getting it into the spreadsheet so that anybody can understand what your results are?
Yeah, excellent question. And I remember when I started my PhD, I kind of sat there with my first batch of data, and it's a lot of data. Like I think off the top of my head, I have something like 10 to 13 terabytes of sound data just from my PhD. That's not all the other side projects that we did. So I was staring at these sound files going, how do I get this just to be data that I can analyze? Like, what am I doing with this? But essentially, step one was, like I said, to create the call library. So really to describe the full repertoire, and that took a whole lot of time manually going through the sound files. So for the data that I collected in my PhD, I basically went through a whole lot of them manually with a fine-tooth comb, like describing in detail all the different structure of all the different call types and what they all mean and the behaviors associated with every single different sound that you might hear at a nest. So once I had that, which was a massive task, that was sort of like my reference library. And so from that, I picked a couple of the key sounds that, in my, I suppose, professional opinion, I thought would be the ones that you would build a recognition algorithm with. And in the sort of first iteration of that, I really focused in on the nestling calls because they're very, very distinct. And so the software essentially goes through and looks for the nestling calls. It then gives you a whole heap of detections, essentially in a spreadsheet, and will tell you the time into the sound file where that detection occurs. And if your software was 100% accurate, you could just trust it. But it's not, and I don't think it ever, is for any species. It's very rare to get really, really accurate results from these call recognizers. It's certainly the exception rather than the rule. So what I then do is basically overlay, it literally is like boxes around the calls based on the time and the frequency. So it will create a little box and put it onto the spectrogram, and then I can just kind of scoot right to it and go, yep, that is a black cockatoo or not. And if it is, I can then decide how much data I want to pull out of that particular box. But for most purposes, we just want to know on a given day, was the nest active? We're not, for other projects, you might want to look at more detailed information from those detections. But for the purposes of just monitoring nesting success, nest survival and nest success, it's just really, was the nest active on that day or not? So once I find a detection and I'm certain that it is from that nest and it's not an adult flying overhead, then it's a yes and move on to the next day. So sorry.
Is the audio analysis software that you're using a modified sort of voice recognition software, or has the or do you know whether the voice recognition software that we can all use now, for transcriptions and whatnot, has developed out of the kind of software that you're using for different purposes?
I'm not sure which way it's gone. I know that the human voice recognition software is more advanced, and that's for a variety of reasons. But again, coming back to what was the outcome, the objective of my research was so that anyone in government or an NGO can pick up the software and use it. So I didn't even look at the really fancy, expensive softwares that you can buy to develop these really complicated deep learning sort of algorithms. I just went straight to open source, and that was all I did because it had to be something that anybody could use. I was very particular about that. So the actual algorithm that the recognizer that I built is pretty basic. It's almost like having, so we call it a template matching algorithm. So you basically just feed in a couple of templates.
Yep.
And not too many, you just maybe 3 to 5, feed that in, and then it will kind of compare the two, just kind of overlay it and go, oh, yep, that's a potential match. And if it's a potential match, it will give it a score of similarity. And then I can kind of test and decide what level of similarity I want before it tells me it's a cockatoo. So all of that actually is quite involved and requires a lot of pilot testing. So what templates do you feed in? What level of similarity do you set? A whole range of different things. But once you've sort of done that legwork, which was a whole chapter in my PhD, we now basically just have a really simple algorithm that doesn't take much computing power to run. And it's just based on 3 templates, and you can just modify the similarity. It's quite remarkable. But I do wish that some of the more complex algorithms were more accessible to ecologists, because I think the accuracy could be improved, but it's just not there yet.
Well, I'm super interested in that process, and I'm really sorry, bird nerds, for going audio nerd for a minute. But the processing software that I use, I can find clicks and pops and door slams and all that just by highlighting that part of the recording.
Yeah.
Tell it to find it, and it will find all those things, and then I can just eradicate them. So I was just wondering where the genesis of that came from, because I know I paid a lot of money for mine. So. Exactly.
And look, research budgets are small, conservation budgets are small, and if it's going to cost you more to use acoustics than it is to just send people out to the field, then nobody's going to use it. So we actually need to make this accessible. But yeah, the real challenges with bioacoustics is mostly false positive detections, and why that happens is because other things sound similar, at least to the software. So in my case, I had a lot of mix-ups with other cockatoos. So even stuff, like species that doesn't sound that similar, at least in our opinion, like sulfur-crested cockatoos or galahs, for instance, that was really confusing the software. And it's taken a while to kind of train it to not detect those as often. But when you think about birds or anything that's easily audible to us humans, they often overlap in frequency or pitch. So the sounds can kind of mask each other, or they can it can get easily mixed up. And when you think of like a spectrogram or a sound file, is essentially a 2D visual representation of the sound. It's not a 3D thing. A template will easily just go, oh yeah, that's it, right? And oh, well, that one's not quite the same because it's got this extra little thing on the end. It doesn't know that extra thing is from some other bird. It goes, oh no, it's part of that 2D chunk of sound, and I'll keep moving on. So there's a lot of issues with that overlap and masking. But this is why for things like bats, which call in like the ultrasonic range detection, like the accuracy can be much higher because there's less things that call so high. And likewise for really low frequency calls as well. Like I do a little bit of work on the Plains Wanderer, and bioacoustics is a really successful tool to find Plains Wanderer because they call at such low frequencies, and there's not much else that does, except for anthropogenic noise, like human noise, wind, and cars and all of that. So, yeah, very interesting.
Can't resist giving a plug, Danny. There's a great previous episode on the Plains Wanderer. Who's the star of that one, Danny?
Yeah, you should go listen to it. Dan does awesome work. He's I think he's still a PhD student. I'm not sure if he's finished yet. And his work is great. You should definitely go and check that out. And yeah, definitely give a plug for the Plains Wanderer, the poor little Plains Wanderer. Not many people know about it, but it's a wonderful little bird.
Yeah. So that's just a couple of episodes back. I couldn't resist.
Yeah.
So Danny, we've been talking mostly about the Kangaroo Island Glossy Black Cockatoo. The controversial issue is it a species?
It's not a species. No, it's not classified as a species. It's a subspecies. So there's 3 subspecies of Glossy Black Cockatoo recognised, 2 on the East Coast, and then the Kangaroo Island subspecies. But I'm sure it has been isolated a very long time. So at what point is a species a species? But it is fairly similar in its behaviour and certainly in its ecology to the East Coast subspecies. So
okay, now just imagine that this hat that I've just put on is my government bureaucrat budget allocation hat. All right, and I say, Daniella, why do we need to allocate these scarce resources that we could be giving to other pork barreling issues in marginal seats? Why do we even need to worry about preserving a subspecies of some black bird?
This is a difficult and potentially loaded question. It depends on what you value, I suppose, and where your ethics lie. I don't necessarily see it as just protecting a subspecies. How do I phrase this? I see it as we're protecting something that is different. It's not different enough to be its own species, but it is different. It's isolated. It's had its own course of evolution. If we value things that are much younger, man-made things that are much younger, why aren't we valuing these, wondrous products of evolution? And it's not just a bird. It's a bird in a landscape, in a habitat, in an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem without all of its parts, which, whatever that means, isn't as valuable to me as if we could preserve those things. But I understand how limited conservation dollars are, and that we really do need to think about how we prioritize where we spend our money. And I'm not saying that because the Kangaroo Island Glossy Black Cockatoo is the most threatened, that all the research money and all the conservation money should go there. I don't think that. In a perfect world, that's what we would do. But just to clarify, I think they are absolutely deserving of protection, but we also need to be realistic.
Well, it's a conundrum, isn't it? Because without really thorough genomic testing of all of our organisms, what we determine is a species is in effect a value judgment based on the weight of evidence that some people give to some data that's in front of them. I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, that's the kind of question that people always put to me when I talk about having a podcast about threatened and endangered birds. Is people say,
Yeah.
well, why do you have to save all of them? You know, and I'm thinking, well, why shouldn't we save all of them? Because we're saying we're committed to maintaining biodiversity.
Mm.
And we don't know if these habitats or these particular organisms might be useful or essential. We just don't know.
Yeah, and I think we need to not get taxonomy mixed up with conservation. And what I mean by that is,
do you mean?
Well, no,
Yeah,
I suppose what I'm saying is that I have heard people say, "Oh, I wish this was its own species, because then we would have more luck with funding." So they actually wish that the taxonomists would go, "Yep, Kangaroo Island Glossy Black Cockatoo is its own species, because then it's more important." I've heard people say that, and I disagree. I think taxonomy is about figuring out or organizing things as close to the truth as we can get to, and that shouldn't influence where our conservation dollars are going. It's not about that, in my opinion.
Well, go back to any bird book, field guide from the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, and tell me, can someone tell me what makes a rosella a species?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If the genomic testing hasn't been done, we're really just pushing pieces around a game board in a sense, because
yeah, I mean, a really good example of this that's very recent is the taxonomy of red-tailed black cockatoos was recently updated, and there is now a new subspecies in West Australia. So what does that mean now? Are they, in terms of what does it mean for their conservation? Because they're a small, now isolated subspecies that used to be considered part of the inland subspecies. But what do we do with that?
Let's muddy the water. When is a race a subspecies is a species? So,
yeah, I
don't know.
I love talking to taxonomists. It's fascinating, but yeah, I don't know what this means for conservation. I mean, a subspecies is, essentially something that's a little bit different and is in its own sort of geographic area. Effectively, that's how they, separate them. But yeah, what does that mean for conservation when suddenly you've got a whole new subspecies? Don't know. Like, where does it leave us?
That's right. Now, as I mentioned before we pressed the go button, I was speaking to someone in a government department who allocates resources and manages an endangered species or threatened species program. So that's coming up. So we're always going to be delving into this stuff, dear listener. Now, Danny, let's talk red-tailed black cockatoos.
Sure.
Tell us what you've done and where you see the priorities for the preservation of red-tailed black cockatoos in general. And you can be as descriptive or as general as you like.
So I mostly work on the red-tailed black cockatoos down in the southeast. So that's southwestern Victoria and South Australia. And they're an isolated subspecies and they are endangered. And so these are the two subspecies that I worked on for my PhD. That was the Kangaroo Island Glossy Black Cockatoo and the southeastern red-tailed black cockatoo. So like I said earlier, the Glossy Black Cockatoo on Kangaroo Island is a real success story. So even though its population is really small, it's isolated, could potentially be wiped out with one fire or one disease outbreak, good management has seen that population go up. The red-tailed black cockatoo in Victoria and South Australia is not that story. It's far worse. Its population is a little bit bigger, but it's still tiny. It's only about 1,500 individuals or so. And we think that that's going down every single year. So the recovery team, or particular people, are really, really concerned about the status of that population. It's isolated by quite a long way from all other red-tailed black cockatoos. So I suppose this gets back into what we were just talking about. Why protect that one? What makes it different to the others? The same study, actually, just getting back to the taxonomy question, the same study that reclassified the taxonomy of red-tailed black cockatoos found that the southeastern subspecies is inbred, or potentially inbred, with the methods that they used. So we now have the very real question of, what do we do about that? Do we
introduce something?
Exactly. And what are the risks with that? I'm not, an expert in genetics at all, but there are other people who we're working with, but these are very real things that we now have to think about. Is the risk of, say, outbreeding depression greater than inbreeding depression? And how do we deal with that? And if we need to bring in some new genetic material, where do we bring it from?
Absolutely. Massive ethical issues to confront there.
Right. And then, is it still a subspecies? What are we losing something of that subspecies by bringing in other genetic material? So tough times for the red-tailed black cockatoo.
Now I'm familiar with that area of Australia, and when I think of that corner, or that, I'll call it a corner of South Australia, and that far west part of Victoria, it's mostly farmland, and the history of the area was, a lot of it was divvied up as soldier settlement land, and an awful lot of it was just squatter properties that have been handed down. Now, when I think of that area, I think of these massive, mature cypress trees and things like that on the landscape. But and for South Australia, I'm thinking of a lot of pine plantation that has come into those areas. Now, is there a lot of contiguous, suitable habitat in that area?
Yeah, well, you're completely right in your description of the area. It is mostly farmland, both grazing and cropping land as well, and plantation. So there's pine and blue gum. The habitat is very fragmented, and most of it has been cleared. So the red-tailed black cockatoo in that particular subspecies is more specialized than the other subspecies of red-tailed black cockatoo, which is partly why it's so threatened. It only feeds on stringy bark and bull oak, but bull oak is almost completely cleared within its distribution, so it's not much of a food source anymore. So they practically just rely on stringy bark these days. And there are some large patches of stringy bark remaining, because they have these really sandy soils that wouldn't have been good for grazing and whatnot. So some of them have been protected, particularly on the Victorian side. The South Australian side is a bit worse. But no, it's very, very fragmented, very patchy, and their distribution has gotten smaller because there are patches of habitat that are a bit further out, say further to the east, but they're not currently able to go that far without stopping along the way, or perhaps they just don't know about it.
Now I'm taking my government bureaucrat hat off for a minute, and I'm putting back on my horticulturist, pretend scientist hat for a minute. Now, when you say bull oak, I'm thinking calitris species.
So I'm talking about Allicasuarina lumanii.
Oh, okay. So it's the Allicasuarina.
Allicasuarina, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So, again, it's quite easy to grow in cultivation. So, is roadside replenishment a strategy that might work in those areas?
Yeah, and not just roadsides. They are actually replanting in paddocks and whatnot.
And farm
farmland, yeah.
laneways. Yeah. So
Yeah.
creating laneways on farms. Okay. So
yeah, exactly. So that is happening. The problem with bull oak is that it is much slower growing. Like, so there's a
very slow
completely
growing.
different situation to the drooping she oak on Kangaroo Island. And there have been some studies that have looked at the age of the trees. The age of the trees need to be before the cockatoos start feeding on them, and it's old. Like, they have to be very old trees. But they're planting stringy bark. There's a whole heap of things that is going on, but yeah, habitat loss has really driven that subspecies down quite quickly. And really the concerns now are fire. Like, I feel like a bit of a broken record. It's fire, but the stringy bark doesn't recover as quickly after fire. So it can take a long time for the redtails to go back and actually feed on the stringy bark after fire has gone through there. And that area of the world's very fire prone. Wildfire, there's also a lot of prescribed burning. So there's some really serious issues down there.
What's the status of ongoing and current research into that population now, Danny?
There's quite a bit going on. So the recovery team is really active, and we're always sort of coming up with new ideas, creating research priorities. They partner with a lot of universities in that region. So I'm a little bit of an odd one out being up here in Brisbane, but everyone else is sort of in that area and they're really familiar with that area. But no, there's a bit going on, particularly with regards to the feeding habitat. So I'm the only one who's currently working on the nesting habitat and nesting success. And that's a joint project with BirdLife Australia and the recovery team. But other than that, we're really starting to look at feeding habitat. So phenology and impacts of fire, that sort of thing. Because they're so specialized, that's really where we need to be focusing our efforts.
And is there any agency or anybody in particular driving that side of the research at the moment?
Well, I mean, it's all driven by the recovery team. Okay. And in terms of the scientific sort of arm of that, there's a few of us who are on there. And the Victorian government has a very strong involvement in that, which is great.
Yeah, I mean that subspecies of the red-tailed black is sort of an icon species for Victoria. So
it is. Yeah, it was the mascot for the Commonwealth Games, apparently.
Precisely.
I don't remember that, but yeah, exactly.
Carrack. Yeah. So that was but it's this is one of the issues for me when it comes to anything to do with communications, when that's talked of as a professional field, communications and conservation is, that was front of mind around Commonwealth Games time, and how quickly it has slipped from our attention. And sadly, there's so many species vying not only for the dollars, but they're also vying for the airtime.
No, you're totally right. I mean, the reason actually that I kind of started on the PhD that I did on black cockatoos was because the southeastern subspecies of red-tailed black cockatoo was on the top 20 priority list under the threatened species strategy, the federal threatened species strategy. So my PhD was actually funded under that and part of the threatened species recovery hub. So they somehow made that top 20 list, but I wasn't obviously involved in the creation of the list. But you could argue that, should other birds have perhaps been on that list, or these things are really difficult. The glossy black cockatoos had nearly no airtime at that point, and they've really been thrown into the spotlight since the bushfires because of the devastation on Kangaroo Island. So now it's kind of flipped. Like, people are really wanting to speak to me mostly about glossy black cockatoos, but 5 years ago it was all about the red-tailed black cockatoos, and now they haven't had a big fire or any major disaster recently, so they've sort of slipped away a little bit. But yeah, we're still here, we're still working on them, still monitoring nests, still planting trees.
Now, Danny, anybody who watches the video doesn't need to be told this, but I'm substantially older than you, and that, and when I was young, the malleefowl was one of the species that was always getting some media attention, and certainly in the publications that I always was getting, like the Australia's Wildlife Heritage and my field guy, my field naturalists and bird observers, Gould League material. The malleefowl was always under threat. Now you've done a fair bit of work with the malleefowl too. So tell us the current situation with the malleefowl. Actually, because a lot of people who listen are overseas. What is a malleefowl? What is a malleefowl? What does it do?
Malleefowl is a wonderful bird. It's a megapode. So if you go back and actually listen to your chat with Rob Davis, you'll learn a little bit about megapodes there. But megapodes are this wonderful group of birds that basically use external sources of heat for incubation. So they build mounds and they lay their eggs in the mounds, and they have very specific, very delicate and precise behaviors to maintain the temperature of the mound exactly where it needs to be, which is just remarkable. And the malleefowl is a little bit different to some of the other megapodes because it occurs in the semi-arid and arid zones of Australia, which is quite remarkable if you think about it, because what they're relying on in these mounds is the decomposition of like leaf litter. So where are they getting that in these dry environments? It's quite astounding that they've been able to sort of exploit that habitat. So yeah, they're a little ground dwelling, I hear them referred to as bush chickens, who build these mounds, and basically incubate their mounds. Their chicks are completely independent from the moment of birth, so 0% parental care, and very, like you say, very widely known, very long history of monitoring them, lots of research, and a huge amount of citizen scientists across the country who are involved in their monitoring today. It's a huge program. And I've only been working on malleefowl for about the last year. So I'm still pretty new to it. I haven't actually seen one yet because COVID meant I couldn't go and do the monitoring last year. So I'm still yet to get out and go see them. So
what will your work, when you're able to get down out there in the mallee, and when we say malleefowl, mallee is a name given to a particular type of habitat that occurs over quite a great deal of southern inland Australia. So the range of the malleefowl in the past had been very extensive, from northern New South Wales, northern Victoria, western New South Wales, right through to Western Australia into that suitable habitat. Not in deserts, but in that sort of intergrade country, but where it's in some countries they might call it woodland, but our understanding of woodland in Australia is slightly different. Mallee is very unique, and dominated.
So they need leaf litter to create their mounds. They're not going to be in the desert, but exactly.
So what's the actual nature of the work you'll be doing with the malleefowl?
Well, so I'm currently actually, it's a funny title. I'm the national coordinator for the recovery group. But really what that means is that I oversee the national monitoring program. So really my work is quite administrative almost. I'm not so much doing the science because most of the field work gets done by volunteers, which is great because that's actually seen the program continue for decades. So there's a real longevity, excellent time series of data, which is rare in conservation. So my work, like I said, is really about coordinating the national program. So I looking after a small team of people who go out to field sites. We have a standardized way of monitoring mounds. So we ensure that right across the country, from New South Wales all the way to WA, we're using exactly the same methods so that we can compare data between the sites. And we also we're always looking for new monitoring sites that we can add into our database and form part of the monitoring program. Because really what we want to do is look at the national trend of malleefowl, because it is one species. There's no subspecies, as far as we know. We consider them to be one. That's not to say there's an isolated populations. They are isolated in certain places, but they're considered to be one subspecies. One species, sorry. So we use the same monitoring methods at mounds right across the country. We collect that data, and then each year we basically report on that data to governments, to NRM groups, whoever else is involved in the program. And we partner with universities. So it's really great. Under the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, which was what my PhD was under, we actually have a malleefowl program under that same initiative as well. So we've been working closely with the University of Melbourne on a really big predator experiment, actually right across the country. So we're looking at how foxes might be impacting malleefowl breeding and actually starting to get a handle on whether that's driving the population decline or not. So there's some great science that's happening.
I'll preface my next question with, aren't cats an issue for malleefowl as well? Or don't we know that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we don't really know anything about how severe an impact these predators are having on malleefowl, which is the whole point of what this experiment is, why it exists. So there's a long-held belief that foxes are impacting malleefowl in a negative way by raiding nests, by raiding mounds, and they do that. We know we have camera traps out there. We know that they get in there. But whether that's actually driving a decline or not is not known. But more importantly, what we don't know is how much of the fox control is actually reducing the fox numbers and whether that has a flow-on effect to malleefowl. So there's a few steps, few links in the chain that we're not quite sure about. So there's a lot of fox baiting that goes on to help malleefowl, but how that reduces fox abundance and then how that subsequently helps malleefowl is not really known. So we're looking at that. But you're right. The question then is, if you are reducing foxes, is there perhaps mesopredator release and there's more cats? And how might that be impacting malleefowl? So it's definitely something we're talking about. And our camera traps, we basically have remote motion sensor cameras out at sites all across the country, and we don't only look for foxes in the cameras, we also look for cats as well as herbivores and a whole range of other things. So we can actually start to tease out some of those effects at some point. We haven't gotten around to doing it yet, but yeah. Unknown.
When I was having a discussion with a bird nerd who shall remain nameless, and we were talking about predator control in general, they posed the question that I thought was a really good one, is unless you achieve total eradication of predators of a predator species over a wide area, are we only leaving behind the smart and adaptable ones?
Yeah.
Let's leave that one out there in the
question.
Air. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Selection. It's artificial selection. Yeah.
So, now I don't profess to have any knowledge or any answers about that, but yeah, the more you think about it, especially foxes, they are pretty, they can be pretty clever critters, those ones. Daddy, what's the main pressure now on the malleefowl over its entire range, and what are the priorities? Is it habitat retention? Is it habitat improvement? Or is it predator control, what do you think are the main, or what? How would you rank 1, 2, 3 there?
Excellent question. And I'm going to have to say I don't know. What we think really is driving malleefowl. At least, so the way we track malleefowl is through breeding activity, so activity at the mounds, and that's a proxy for how well the population is doing. The most recent research that's come out has suggested actually that rainfall is most important, and you can kind of guess why that might be.
All right, so number 4, climate change.
Well, number 1, climate change. Exactly. Yeah. So we're quite concerned about the impacts of decreased rainfall from climate change, in addition to fire. Fire is a huge concern. Again, I sound like a broken record. All the species I work on is like fire.
This is the really interesting thing about this field, and why, as somebody who comes into it as a bird lover and a sort of naturalist as a child, that it's so frustrating, is that the policymakers always say, show me the evidence, show me the evidence. They go, hey, haven't you been awake for 50 years? I mean, it's like, how much evidence do you need? Do we know if the population is stable or if it's rapidly decreasing?
It's different in different parts of the country. So we don't have a lot of data from New South Wales. So New South Wales is our least sort of studied part of their range, but that's improving. So there is like a recovery group there now, and they've started doing some monitoring. So we're not sure about New South Wales. Victoria is fairly stable. So Victoria is sort of where most of the research began, and stuff you're probably reading in, I don't know, the 80s or whatnot.
70s, 80s, the 70s for me.
A lot of the research and the monitoring was happening there. But in other parts.
Desert.
The
little desert and sunset country. And when I was a kid, I could not wait to go there. So
yeah. I know. I can't wait to go there.
I'll never forget seeing my first malleefowl mound. And unfortunately, it wasn't active. It was a historical one, but the person who was leading me through that area that day said, but they're not using it now, but someone will be using it soon.
Yeah, they might come back. That's right. They'll resurrect their mounds. Yeah. It is very they're a remarkable bird, but all the indicators suggest that they are sort of declining in the best monitored places other than Victoria, and so overall nationally they seem to be going down. But the drivers of that is something we're still trying to figure out, and it's very hard with things like climate change to actually, we can't make it rain more, so how are we gonna manage this in the future?
Look, Danny, we could go on and on and on about black cockatoos and malleefowl forever and ever, but we have to leave some questions out there now. Now, some people tell me the next part of the show is actually their favourite, and this is where we work out where Danny sits on the bird nerd spectrum. So strap in, listeners.
I know, I can already see where this is going.
So, Danny, what's your field guide of choice when you're out there doing your field work?
I don't really need a field guide for my field work, but I pretty much only have the Australian Bird Guide now. I'm dedicated to that. I love it.
Yeah, you love it. That's high praise indeed. And,
although there is a mistake on I think it's the red-tailed black cockatoos.
Well,
I can't quite remember what it is, but when I bought it, I was like,
And have you written to the publisher?
No.
Well, if anyone's listening or watching and they know the writing team or the editorial team, check out have a close look. Red-tailed black cockatoo, and
Mm.
fix it up for the next edition, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's in the number of subspecies. I think it says 6 and it's 5 or something like that. Yeah.
Oh well, depending on which edition, it's going to be different for time immemorial.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, taxonomy. We've already tried to unscramble that egg.
Yeah.
We're not going back there. When you're out in the field, what's your favourite piece of kit?
Gosh, I know it's going to sound cliche, but my sound recorder. Well, absolutely, my sound recorder. Yeah.
Now let's geek out on that. What have you used, and which model or which type is best when you're just? I mean, I'm assuming you go out there and do some recording for fun sometimes.
I do. So obviously for my scientific endeavors, I have specific recorders that we leave out there. For my PhD, I just had some really cheap little, I can't even remember what it was. It was some Panasonic or something, tiny little sound recorder that I just stuck a microphone into and used that. But what I actually use now is the Rode VideoMic Pro on my camera. Because that is really high quality. I can extract the sound files from that and get a lot of information. So I mostly just use that nowadays, because then I can capture some film as well if it's during the day. But even at night, I will still just use that one. And I love coming back home from a weekend camping and just going into the sound files and looking at it. It's super nerdy of me, but it's so relaxing. It's almost like a meditation.
Well, it's good because you're getting your nerd points really highly weighted.
I'm high on the nerd scale, probably low on the bird scale.
Yeah, well, see, I've got a funny feeling when I say, are you keeping a list, and are you a ticker or a flicker? You know,
I'm not a list maker.
No.
There are rare exceptions. Sometimes I'll get in the mood and I'll pull out my eBird app and I'll do a survey, but mostly it's because I'm driven to provide data to a project rather than caring about my own list. And when I do go in the field with people who truly are bird nerds, I'm like a fish out of water. Just find me the cockatoos, I'm happy.
Look, be honest. When you're out in the field with some of them, you're giving them a bit of side eye, aren't you? Going,
absolutely.
What's going on here? So,
see, my thing, and this is in my non-bird life. I love to go in the ocean and go scuba diving. I love fish and all of that. And this is very similar to the way I like to go diving. Is if I'm diving or if I'm in the forest, I like to just get to a spot and just chill and just watch nature and just be sort of absorbed in the moment. I'm not there to go, right, I've seen that species, let's move on, next one. I'm quite happy to just sit at one watering hole and just enjoy it. I don't need to maximize my species count. So
the label I give to you is that you're immersive. It's the experience. It's the experience, and not the quantum that is important. That's great. Now, again, we can extend this perhaps a little bit wider than a bird location. But have you got a bucket list location that you haven't been yet that you want to get your field recorder out?
Oh, there's so many. Where do I begin? Really, at the moment, I'm dreaming of the tropical islands of the Pacific, which maybe after listening to Rob's talk, I was, on that mission. But there's so many incredible birds on all those small Pacific islands, and I would love to get out there and record some of their sounds because they're so understudied. So yeah, places like the Cook Islands, would love to. I've been there once before, but I would love to explore that with a sound recorder. So one day.
The red-throated lorikeet is coming up. Just we've got that one coming up. So
Great.
I'm sure
I'll
they could
tune
do
in.
it. I'm sure they could do with a hand that
Yeah.
team. What about a species? Do you have like a the top of your wish list?
Well, since I work on Malleefowl and Plains Wanderer, and I've seen neither, they're pretty high on the list.
Yeah, okay.
But I have to say, higher than that would be palm cockatoos, because I've never seen a palm cockatoo, and it's my home state. I need to get up to Cape York and go and see the palm cockatoos. So that's probably number one.
Have you seen one in captivity?
Yes, I have.
Oh, yeah. So you won't actually be shocked by how bloody big they are when you actually see them.
I know they're incredible. And I mean, there's wonderful research on their vocalizations too. So I feel like I'm really across the science on palm cockatoos, especially their vocalizations. And I've never seen one, so have to do a trip up north. So,
and I think you've got an amazing location where you're living now. Are you in the foothills of the Gold Coast there?
Yeah, pretty much. Yep. So I explore Springbrook and Lamington and those places quite a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll do a slight bit of the variation. What's your favourite local location that you get out to, and what's the best thing, the best nature-y thing that you've seen? Because we have to be a bit broader with you, because you're a self-confessed non-bird nerd. How did I let you on here?
I know. Good question. I don't only work on birds. I also work on frogs and stuff. Yeah, so I really love the rainforest, the subtropical rainforests around the Gold Coast hinterland. But what just came to mind when you asked me that question, I was thinking of North and South Stradbroke Islands. That's sort of I just love both of those islands, especially North Stradbroke Island, which is a bit easier to explore than South Stradbroke. It has some beautiful forests, incredible lake systems. In terms of nature experiences and feeling quite remote, but it's not that far away from Brisbane. They would be the top of my list for sure.
Yeah, walking around the south end of the Perch Lake is pretty incredible on North Stradbroke.
So incredible. That's and good spot to see glossies as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you know how Stradbroke is bouncing back after they had their fires?
No, not really. I know that the glossies have still been hanging around the usual spots, so they seem to have done okay. There's a lot of she oak on Stradbroke Island, particularly because when the mine site rehabilitation, they often just plant she oaks, or at least the older sites. That's all they did. So there's plenty of food for them. And there's still people calling me up saying, "Hey, we've got them in our backyard. I think they're nesting." So they're doing okay, but I'm not sure. Those fires were pretty massive. So, yeah.
Well, let's try and find a positive note to land on.
Absolutely.
Just in your opinion, because all the work hasn't been done, what are your general feelings? What's your gut feeling on the future of the glossy and the red-tailed blacks in the eastern part of Australia in general? What's the future?
It's hard to say. I am worried. I think that we have not spent nearly enough time thinking about the glossies on the East Coast. And I say that knowing that Kangaroo Island is in a far more perilous situation, but I think we're not paying enough attention to what's going on here. And we have seen some very strange things happening since the fires up here, because we also had big fires in southeast Queensland at the same time. So there's been some very strange movements of the birds. I think with climate change, their distribution may shift a bit. So I'm worried. I'm definitely worried. The thing we actually really don't know is what is going on further north in Queensland. So that subspecies in northern Queensland is, no one has really worked on them at all. So no idea what the situation is up there. But here in southeast Queensland, the habitat is still being cleared. It's not really protected. So yeah, I'm not overly hopeful that things are doing particularly well. So that's not the happy note that we wanted to.
Let's try and inject a little bit of positivity. If you're listening or you're watching and you've got an interest in parrots, cockatoos, or habitat retention in general, pick up your writing implement and get your piece of parchment and write to someone who makes decisions, because a piece of parchment with some lead or some ink on it has about 40 times the impact of signing a petition online or sending a nasty tweet or sending an email or something like that. While I'm not ridiculing any of those efforts, support the work that Danny's been doing, and don't let all the academic library of work that's been done over 20, 30, 40 years go to waste because we lose them. Write a letter to your MP, to your local government, to the federal government, to the state government, anyone you can think of who has a vote when it comes to allocating resources and protecting habitat.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Written and authorised by Grant Williams from the bird emergency.
It's an emergency. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, it is. That's exactly why the podcast is called what it is, because, I think we're in that critical point where the next 5 to 10 years are going to be really important. Even, do you know, I saw something on bird Twitter the other day which astounded me. People in England were beside themselves because somebody had seen a tree sparrow in the wild. I mean,
yeah.
No,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I know what. Yeah. Yeah.
That just led me to think
volumes. Yeah.
Well, that just led me to think, wow, the emergency bit is dead set right. So, well, Danny, thanks. I'm wrapped to have virtual met you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a great chat. We covered lots of things. So,
and I can recommend. Danny's got an interest in photography, so I can recommend you visiting Daniella Teixiera. And let's do the spelling, Danny.
Sure,
you can do that.
Teixiera. It's Portuguese name.
So DanielaTeixiera.com, and you can launch out to everywhere. Danny's on Twitter,
or
on
probably more easily
Facebook
findable one, on social media.
So, and of course, I'll link wherever I can. And look, I've really enjoyed our chat, Danny, and thanks for doing the work you do.
Thank you.
That's what I really want to get out there for people. It's not easy doing field work, and it's certainly not easy getting the resources to do field work. And I appreciate the massive amount of unpaid hours that you do when you're putting it in. You're just like a school teacher, in my view. So good on you.
Thanks, Grant. That's lovely to say. All right. Well, thank you for having me, and I'll keep listening. I'm looking forward to all your future interviews.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I'm Grant Williams. That's been the Bird Emergency, and she's been Daniella Teixiera. Let me get it right. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks.